Alright, today's video is on Biosphere Part 4. This is Biodiversity. Your questions for today are, what is the difference between exponential growth and logistic growth? That came from yesterday's video. And it also asks, which is the human population on Earth currently undergoing? Exponential or logistic? Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about biodiversity like I just mentioned. So we're going to talk specifically different species here. So our most precious resource is the variety of life that we find on planet Earth. That's a very important factor for Earth itself, and that is known as biodiversity. So the variety of life we have here on our planet. Species within ecosystems are all interconnected. We talked about that before. So if a key species disappears, the whole health of that ecosystem can be changed and affected. And there are three types of biodiversity. There's genetic diversity. So that's just a difference in DNA among individuals. There's species diversity, a variety of species in a given area. Or you have ecosystem diversity, and that's a variety of habitats, ecosystems, and community. Okay, so if you think about genetic diversity, it's a difference between, let's say, you and your brother, or you and your sister, or you and your mom and dad. Okay, species diversity is a difference between being a frog and a deer. Ecosystem diversity is based off of that habitat that you're in. So it could be a mountain region, or it could be the desert. You're going to have different species depending on where you're at. So biodiversity is valuable for several different reasons. The first is community interaction, beauty and inspiration. Think about the fish in the ocean. There are so many colors that are bright and bold and just a beautiful array of colors that you see within the ocean. Oxygen, food, clothing, shelter, all of those things are affected by biodiversity. Development of medication, identification of new and helpful products for humans. Okay, all of this plays off of biodiversity and how different things are in each area. We also have what's known as invasive species. These are non-native organisms that spread very easily. So these are organisms that are not natural to the area. So a lack of limiting factors, so a lack of specific things will help these invasive species to grow. So if there's a lack of predators, if there's a lack of parasites or competition between populations, that helps those to grow. And we'll talk more about invasive in just a minute. But not all invasive are harmful. Okay? The European honeybee, for example, it is invasive to North America. It's not naturally found here. It was brought in and has populated. But even though it's invasive, it's not a bad thing. It's benefiting us because it's pollinating our agricultural crops. Okay, so that's one example, and there are other examples, not all of them, but there are a few where it's actually beneficial to have an invasive species. We do have some threats to biodiversity. So we have habitat destruction, introduced, so new species coming in, and overexploitation. So if you take a look at the images here, the rhino, this rhino has actually had his horn removed. And poachers will actually do that so that they can gain money from the horn of a rhinoceros. Okay, so that's kind of exploitation of that animal. Habitat destruction, when we're mining or when we're creating new industrial areas or putting in, new development for housing or whatever, that's destroying the habitat of those creatures. And then, of course, the introduced species. If you take a look at this image, I don't know if any of you have actually seen this here, but if you go across the Smokies, you can see a lot of trees that, even in the summertime, have no growth. They are completely, well, not completely, but they are dying on the inside. They have no green. They're really not very pretty to look at. They're actually, what they're called are hemlock trees. And what happened is these little white nodules you see here, that's what's called the woolly adelgid. And that was brought in the 1940s by a woman who had went to Japan and brought back a tree. And she planted it in her front yard. Well, this woolly adelgid is asexual. So it recreates, it reproduces by itself. It doesn't need anything else to help it do that. So when it does this, it attaches to these hemlock trees and it eats it from the outside in. And it basically kills this tree. And there's not really anything that anybody can do to stop it. Now, yes, you can use pesticides, insecticides. There are things that you can do to treat it, but it won't ever completely make it go away. Okay, so just be mindful, especially if you're one who wants to get out of Franklin and go somewhere else. Be mindful of what you're bringing back into our community. Conservation biology, it's the application of biology to counter the loss of biodiversity. So that's where we're actually putting in new things to help conserve our biological wildlife. So botany, these are your biological sciences: botany, zoology, microbiology, genetics, evolution, ecology, and physiology. All of those things are biological sciences. Okay, we're talking about ecology now. Your applied management science, so actual things that you have that's applied to wildlife or applied to the open world, is wildlife, fisheries, agriculture, range science, and forestry. And together, all of these things create the population and the conservation of biology. So they come together studying these things and creating this management system to counteract the loss of biodiversity, so to put it back into our communities and our systems. So what we have is the Endangered Species Act. This Endangered Species Act, it doesn't mean that there are no more of that species, but it means they're incredibly low. So it forbids governments and citizens from harming that list of species and those habitats. It also forbids a trade in products made from those listed species. So, for example, for a long time, the bald eagle, the symbol of the United States, has been on the endangered species list. Okay, but because we have because there are places around the world who have habitats for the bald eagle, they're actually reproducing and helping to regenerate that population. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Dollywood, but they have the wild eagle habitat where they're actually, procuring wild eagles and putting them back into nature once they've reproduced. So another thing that the Endangered Species Act does is that it requires the United States Fish and Wildlife Service to maintain that official list of endangered and threatened species. And they have to develop a recovery plan for each of those species. So if anybody's interested in going into forestry or wildlife services, this is kind of what you're going to be doing. Not all the time, but most of the time you're going to be looking at keeping that list of endangered species up to date and developing plans to recover those, to help those reproduce and gain more back in those species. We have what's called single species approaches to conservation. That's captive breeding programs, just like I just talked about with the bald eagles. That is a captive breeding program. They have a species survival plan for those. And we also now have cloning. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Dolly the sheep, but she was an actual clone of her first, her original self. And you guys can go look that up later. But we also have biodiversity hotspots. And this is what we call a hotspot approach. And it focuses on an area with the greatest number of species, which can be protected with the least amount of effort. So, for example, in Honshu, Japan, it is a huge biodiversity hotspot. And they have what's called northern pintail ducks. So it takes the least amount of effort to protect this huge number of species in this area. So that's what they call a hotspot. And that's it for today.